Now look, it doesn't take a genius to tell you all the ways that the Joker sequel movie is such a blatant middle finger directed at its own audience, and why most people, both fans and moviegoers alike, absolutely hated it, and rightfully so. It basically all boiled down to the fact that the movie is a relatively pointless musical which adds nothing to justify the inconsistent stylistic choice. The plot is paper thin, the movie is overly self-indulgent and padded to absolute shit. The story, what little there is, builds to a crescendo that never actually happens, and the final act does a complete 180 designed to subvert the expectations of the audience, but instead assassinates the character development of the main protagonist up to that point and basically just punishes the audience for caring before casually killing him off in the most unceremonious way possible. Now, I made a video detailing all the reasons why people, myself included, hate that movie with an absolute passion, but that's not what this video is going to talk about. This video is about what actually happened with Joker 2, and more importantly, the why. Why did this happen? Why was one of the most anticipated sequels in recent years and the easiest money to be made from a DC comic book movie squandered, and who's responsible for it? Since the film has released two abysmal box office numbers that have and will not come anywhere close to the success relished by its prequel, new details from behind the scenes on making this film have surfaced, which we're going to discuss and hopefully come to a satisfying conclusion. Though admittedly, some of this will just come down to speculation on my behalf, based on the information that's currently in the public eye, and you're all welcome to come to your own conclusions. Though, let's be fair, there has been plenty of speculation from disgruntled fans who are disappointed with the Joker sequel film, lots of theories running wild, and a lot of it has just been utterly baseless. How and why did this happen? So let's try to answer that now. The creative mentality behind Joker Folie A Deux comes across as an insulting middle finger with contempt for its audience because, well, it is. And I don't care what anyone says. As big of a misfire as this film is, I refuse to believe it was just an artistic direction that simply didn't pay off. You don't misread the room that badly. Todd Phillips directed both the original Joker film and its sequel, and Todd Phillips and Scott Silver wrote the screenplays for the original Joker film and its sequel. They knew what they were trying to achieve with the first film, so why pull a complete 180 with the creative direction of the sequel? I have heard a ton of theories, the most absurd being that Todd Phillips hated the idea of a sequel so much because he was afraid that his evil Warner Brothers overlords would run Joker into the ground with endless, terrible subsequent movies. So then Todd Phillips decided that he himself would make a terrible sequel instead, putting down Yeller before he got too old. Now, my knee-jerk reaction to this theory is that it was absolutely ridiculous.
You stupid.
Not only that, but after doing about a minute's worth of research on the matter, I came across this article from November 2019 that details Todd Phillips pushing back on misinformation given by The Hollywood Reporter that a sequel to Joker was already on its way, which turned out to be complete bullshit. Phillips went on to say that THR's reports of an already confirmed sequel, quote, came out of nowhere, and that he, Scott Silver, and Joaquin Phoenix did not have deals in place for a mandatory second movie. And that with the overwhelming success that the first Joker movie was currently experiencing, there had obviously been talks of a possible sequel, but no serious meetings with Warner Brothers regarding it had, as of that time, taken place yet. In other words, you can immediately cross off the whole Todd Phillips spiting Warner Brothers with a crappy sequel nonsense. However, another far more plausible theory I've heard is that despite the first Joker film being highly successful, making over $1 billion total at the worldwide box office and garnering praise from both critics and audience members, it also angered much of the mainstream media who weren't particularly high on the film, deeming it very problematic. Ergo, the quote-unquote wrong people loved the first Joker film, leaving what would be perceived by the writer-director as a stain on his name, likely meaning long-term repercussions for his career. Thus, Todd Phillips decided to drastically overcompensate with the script for the sequel, resulting in middle fingering the bulk of the audience members who enjoyed his original film for its quote-unquote wrong message and or the quote-unquote wrong reasons. Now, so far, this is the only theory I've heard from the masses that I find even somewhat plausible. However, there are some major contradictions to this, mainly from Todd Phillips himself, who from all the way back in 2019 was unapologetically speaking out against much of the outrage backlash surrounding his movie by the mainstream media, which, to be fair, should absolutely be commended on his behalf. In this interview he did with The Wrap in 2019, prior to Joker's release, Phillips talks about how it's a good thing that a movie can raise discourse over serious issues plaguing society. He also calls out the cultural zeitgeist for constantly being on the prowl for an easy target that they can pounce on, and Joker was simply the latest victim of that. To be clear here, we're talking about the first Joker movie and not the shitty sequel. Relax. And then Phillips finally goes on to refer to outrage as a commodity and how eye-opening it had been for him to observe the discourse and all the outrage surrounding his movie, and he even goes on to call out the far-left outrage mob for sounding exactly like the far-right when it just so happens to suit their agenda. Bravo, Todd! Mad props on that one. And if we might just take a little detour, it's also worth noting that Todd Phillips absolutely despises woke culture, which is the biggest culprit for unwarranted, far-left outrage mobs trying to cancel or censor anything that can be even remotely construed as being offensive or problematic, especially in entertainment. Now, by Phillips' own admission, it was the rise of woke culture that prompted him to step away from making comedy films, which I will now quote. "Go try to be funny nowadays with this woke culture," Phillips told Vanity Fair. "There were articles written about why comedians don't work anymore. I'll tell you why. Because all the fucking funny guys are like, fuck this shit, because I don't want to offend you," he continued. "It's hard to argue with 30 million people on Twitter. You just can't do it, right? So you just go, I'm out. And you know what? With all my comedies, I think that's what comedies in general all have in common, is they're irreverent. So I go, how do I do something irreverent, but fuck comedy? Oh, I know, let's take the comic book movie universe and turn it on its head with this." And so that's really where that came from. Bear that last little sentence in mind, as it was not the only intention behind the Joker movie and why it was made, which we'll come back to. But returning to that article with The Wrap, like I said, Todd Phillips has a point, but the only indication that his thought process for developing a second Joker film and its story direction might have changed, because Todd Phillips called the outrage he received from the first movie an eye-opening experience, but he doesn't refer to it as being a negative or a positive eye-opener. Though he did call outrage a commodity, so I guess he's flying fucking high now. And granted, this interview also took place before Joker was even released. And as we discussed, nearly 2 months after it was released, there were no serious meetings having taken place about making a sequel. So I highly doubt this outrage mob backlash directed towards the first Joker movie when it came out affected Todd's approach to making a sequel, especially since no one knew just how successful Joker would be. If anything, I think it would have encouraged Todd to trust his instincts, since his instincts on the first Joker movie were proved absolutely correct and would have likely bolstered his artistic confidence, and therefore I don't see any reason why Todd Phillips would have hated the idea of making a sequel, nor why he would deviate so spitefully from his previous work until after the movie was released and the film's reception had been made public, aside from perhaps being on a massive ego trip because everyone loved his movie, and the only wide enough demographic of people who hated the film and thought a creative shift was warranted was the mainstream media and the far-left woke mob that Todd Phillips has happily gone on record saying that he despises. The only other notable demographic that didn't exactly dig the first Joker movie were certain DC comic book fans who prefer a much more traditional portrayal of the Joker, but as we all know, they certainly weren't taken into account during the creative development on the Joker sequel either.
No shit.
And speaking of DC, In the aftermath of Joker 2's abysmal reception, and remember this is the media that I'm referencing here, so take most of it with a heavy grain of salt, since largely what their sources consist of on matters like this are a bunch of unnamed insiders who apparently know all of the behind-the-scenes details of what happened on the film. Gee, how very convenient for them. But one of the more interesting takeaways from these sources in this instance is that Todd Phillips supposedly froze out the newly appointed heads of DC, those being James Gunn and Peter Safran. And Phillips dealt with Warner Brothers directly and only Warner Brothers. This is loosely supported by both Gunn and Safran's notable absence from the Joker sequel's premiere screening at the TCL Chinese Theatre, despite Gunn openly supporting the film publicly on his social media. But granted, as one of the new heads of DC Creative, it would be unprofessional to not do everything you can to help promote someone who's playing for your team, despite personal feelings towards them that may or may not be positive. However, there's also the notable fact that the DC logo was omitted from the opening credits of Joker 2. Another insider goes as far as to say that, quote, Todd wanted nothing to do with DC, and that he had built rapport with certain Warner Brothers executives that allowed him to bypass input and restrictions that would have been laid upon him from DC Creative. Those executives being Michael DeLuca and Pamela Abdi. However, the article goes on to say that an unnamed DC representative downplays these rumors of creative tension and friction behind the scenes. Apparently, Gunn was just busy with another project, and Safran was sick the day of Joker's premiere. The representative also goes out of his way to note that the DC logo is shown after the credits of Joker 2, which, okay, that still doesn't answer the question of why it wasn't in the opening of the film, when the entire audience would have been informed that, yes, this is still a DC picture that's about a character they know and love from the comics, but then again, that's only important for selling tickets and not the movie itself, right?
Ding, ding, ding! What do we have for her, Johnny?
As audiences would come to find out. And furthermore, apparently Todd Phillips declined to make any comment about his decision to leave out the DC logo. No surprise there. However, when questioned by a Collider reporter, always nice to hear from those clowns, no pun intended, when questioned about the possible creative shift on the production, which started 2 months after Gunn and Safran were appointed at DC, Todd Phillips had this to say, quote, with all due respect to them, it's kind of a Warner Brothers movie, end quote. Well now, doesn't that spell things out for us? And what's even more interesting, and provides a much wider window into the psyche of Todd Phillips, is if we look at the script draft for the original Joker film written back in 2018, a little note from both Todd Phillips and Scott Silver reads, quote, this story takes place in its own universe. It has no connection to any of the DC films that have come before it. We see it as a classic Warner Brothers movie. Gritty, intimate, and oddly funny. The characters live in the real world, and the stakes are personal. Although it is never mentioned in the film, the story takes place in the past. Let's call it 1981. It's a troubled time. The crime rate in Gotham is at record highs. A garbage strike has crippled the city for the past 6 weeks. And the divide between the quote haves and the quote have-nots is palpable. Dreams are beyond reach, slipping into delusions. And at the end of it, it's got both men's initials. So what I'm getting from all this is that Joker was intended to be seen as a psychological drama first and foremost, and not as a comic book film.
No shit.
I'm sure many of you could have already guessed that, but given all of this recent info from sources, not to mention the actions and statement from Todd Phillips himself, I think it's safe to assert that Todd Phillips really doesn't like the idea of comic book movies. Perhaps he sees them as cheapening the movie art form, or just perhaps cheapening his own art, hence why he clearly wanted to distance himself from DC during the first Joker movie, which, like it or not, I think actually helped this movie tremendously in reaching a broader audience. However, it seems he tripled down on doing just that for the sequel, this time without the best of intentions, which, as we all know, ended disastrously. If you're familiar with the death of the DCEU, you'd know that the vast majority of the failures that franchise faced shouldn't fall on the shoulders of DC, but rather on the ineptitude of Warner Brothers, putting DC's creative in the worst possible situations in order to compete with Marvel Studios. The fact that Todd Phillips disliked the idea of Joker being a DC film and then avoiding them like the plague for the sequel tells me that DC would have likely not gone in this creative direction had they been involved, and they certainly wouldn't have allowed Todd Phillips to gorge himself on his own self-indulgence and make his musical. Now, some have speculated that Todd Phillips wanted to make a psychological drama about mental illness with a main character that just so happened to be called Arthur Fleck. But due to a lack of marketability, Warner Brothers insisted that Phillips change it into a Joker film. Although, from what I've gathered, that isn't exactly true. Surprisingly enough, it's also incredibly accurate. It's just that once again, people were pointing at the wrong culprits. See, initially, I myself gave Todd Phillips the benefit of the doubt, thinking that he took an interest in the Joker character as kind of a blueprint to tell a deconstructive story about the character's psyche in a similar kind of vein as Logan did back in 2017. And this would explain why, despite a ton of inaccuracies to the source material, that Arthur Fleck's Joker still shares some of the Joker's character traits beyond just the superficial, though granted not many, but for example, his twisted sense of humor.
Knock, knock. It's the police, ma'am. Your son's been hit by a drunk driver. He's dead.
However, if we dial it back to that same interview given by Phillips with The Wrap in 2019, prior to the original Joker film's release, in an attempt to fire back at the mainstream for insisting that Joker was actively attempting to incite gun violence and glorify incel culture, Todd Phillips responded with what I'd imagine now will be seen as a slip of the tongue, where he says that the film wasn't trying to glorify that kind of behavior, and then he goes on to detail a very frank exchange between himself and Joaquin Phoenix, saying that, quote, I literally described to Joaquin at one point in those 3 months as like, look at this as a way to sneak a real movie into the studio system, under the guise of a comic book film. It wasn't, we want to glorify this behavior. It was literally like, let's make a real movie with a real budget and we'll call it fucking Joker. That's what it was. End quote.
Wow.
Okay, look, I'll always stand by the original Joker as being a damn good film despite its terrible sequel, despite Todd Phillips, but fuck if that little excerpt doesn't leave a bad taste in my mouth towards the movie in hindsight. This also supports the notion that Todd Phillips detested any and all involvement from DC to cheapen his movie by them tinkering with it in a manner that made it even remotely resembling a comic book film, or even vaguely inspired by the comics. However, Todd Phillips, being a mad dog at the helm, wanting to protect his vision at all costs at the detriment of everyone else, doesn't end with freezing out DC. Back to that Variety article from 2024, apparently there was some additional clashing with Warner Brothers behind the scenes because Phillips refused to allow the film to be test screened. Okay, what the fuck? $200 million for a movie, the budget of which Todd Phillips himself has gone on record saying is a completely absurd estimate, just for the record, but with a much, much larger budget than the original Joker film, and the motherfucker didn't want to do any test screenings? And what's even more bewildering is that Warner Brothers allowed this to happen. Fucking what? Millions upon millions upon millions of dollars, and you corporate greedy fucks apparently pussied out and agreed to no test screenings. No wonder your stock is plummeting. Todd Phillips apparently did this for the sake of the audience, not having plot points ruined for them with leaks. Though, let's be real here, there are precautions you can take for that, and given the aftermath of the film's reception, I think the more likely reason for this was that Phillips was protecting himself. I'd imagine he knew those test screenings would have likely been just as abysmal, and Warner Brothers might have taken some serious action to get him to change his movie or do reshoots which would have fucked with his own incredibly self-indulgent vision. Now granted, personally, I myself am always pro-artist first. The artist on their own creation should get the final say on everything for better or worse, because that's precisely what makes it art in the first place and not a carefully catered product. However, Todd Phillips did not create the Joker. The films may be his vision, but he's taking creative liberties with something that he did not create, and with money that isn't his. So this is one of those instances where I think it's perfectly ethical for an artist being reined in by his corporate overlords, and God knows this film sorely needed it. Hell, I even made a point about this in my DCEU video. Why the fuck does Warner Brothers always get involved at the wrong time? Anyway, to cap off that article from Variety, it also goes on to speculate that Bradley Cooper not being a presence as producer on the Joker sequel, since he was in fact a producer on the original Joker film, might have had a hand in helping Todd Phillips check his worst creative impulses and nonsensical story choices, but wasn't able to do so on Joker 2 since Cooper apparently cut producing ties with Phillips in 2021. And one of the quote-unquote sources who provided this was apparently directly involved with the film. They went on to say that, quote, nobody could get through to Todd, and when it comes to genres, if you don't listen to fan expectations, you are going to fail. Again, there's no name or face to attach to this source, so he or she could just be blowing smoke in hindsight now that the negative reception to the Joker sequel is something tangible. As for fan expectations, and I briefly discussed this in my video, there shouldn't be this unwritten contract that artists have to meet the expectations of fans, because every fan has their own separate checklist of expectations. And to do so, that's how you get some of the most out-of-touch, cringeworthy committee trash, like the modern-day Marvel films, even though some of them might take in a ton of money by meta jokes and fanboy wishlist box ticking in lieu of an actual story. Yeah, that tends to happen from time to time, but that's also how the art of movie making becomes diminished, and that's also why the market is currently vastly oversaturated with mostly shitty comic book movies. Storytelling isn't about catering to what people want, it's about giving them what they didn't know that they wanted, based on the expectations that have been set up by the artists themselves. And this is where Joker 2 dropped the ball big time, and where I guess, if there's any truth to this insider's words, Todd Phillips failed to deliver. Speaking of Todd Phillips, in regards to his creative decisions, and the much maligned third act twist and the unfulfilling ending to the Joker sequel, Phillips recently spoke out to address some of the backlash in October 2024 with Entertainment Weekly. Yeah, those fucking knobs. But anyway, here's what Phillips had to say in regards to Arthur Fleck. Quote, he realized that everything is so corrupt, it's never going to change, and the only way to fix it is to burn it all down, director Todd Phillips tells Entertainment Weekly when asked about Arthur's decision to confess his sins to the jury near the end of Folie A Deux. Quote, when those guards kill that kid in the hospital, he realizes that dressing up in makeup, putting on this thing, it's not changing anything. In some ways, he's accepted the fact that he's always been Arthur Fleck. He's never been this thing that's been put upon him. This idea that Gotham people put on him, that he represents. He's an unwitting icon. This thing was placed on him and he doesn't want to live as a fake anymore. He wants to be who he is. Phillips admits that, quote, the sad thing is, he's Arthur and nobody cares about Arthur. Pointing out that Gaga's Lee, quote, never says Arthur in the film until she leaves him on the same steps he danced atop in the original movie. Quote, she's realizing I'm on a whole other trip, man. You can't be what I wanted you to be. He explains. Phillips also confirms that while boasting a dreamlike quality, the final exchange between Lee and Arthur is, quote, actually really happening, and isn't an imagined interaction like Arthur's fake romance with Sophie in the prior installment. Okay, I can, to an extent, understand the whole Harley Quinn is only interested in Joker and not Arthur Fleck. That much tracks from the film itself, even though it lends to a very pointless and empty conclusion. The part that doesn't make a lick of sense, even coming from Todd Phillips himself, is how Arthur just all of a sudden gave up due to the corruption being so widespread that nothing will ever change, and that his is a pointless endeavor. It's one thing for the writers and the audience to know that Arthur's whole symbolic uprising as the Joker was always doomed to fail, but it's another thing to just completely change a character's mindset to suit the message you want to convey. Arthur throughout the entire film is chomping at the bit to embrace being the Joker again, and only holds back on it due to advice from his legal counsel, which he eventually fires because he wants to embrace all the attention and freedom that his new identity has given him. So this ridiculous idea that he just gets sexually assaulted in prison for some reason, and then listens to one of those same guards brutally kill one of his fellow inmates who just so happens to be a Joker fan, and this is what makes him realize how fruitless his quote-unquote fantasy is, causing him to renounce the Joker and alienate all of his followers, including Harley Quinn, who the film wasted most of its fucking runtime building up their relationship for, is complete bullshit. And all it does is completely assassinate the character. Arthur has faced a lifetime of misery, all of which only pushed him towards being the Joker because that was his escape from the tragedies of his past. Embracing the Joker at the end of the first film was the straw that broke the camel's back. He finally snapped. He embraced madness. And he even goes on the Murray Franklin show to say,
I got nothing left to lose. Nothing can hurt me anymore. My life is nothing but a comedy.
Phillips talks about Arthur realizing that he's not changing anything by dressing up as Joker and being a revolutionary symbol. It would be one thing if the film actually earned that twist, but the reason why it left so many people baffled and angry is because it felt like the movie barely got going because too much time Phillips thought was better spent on fucking sing-alongs, instead of showing how and why the Joker crusade was always going to end in depressing tragedy. The audience never got a payoff for the setups laid in both the first film and the sequel. Hence they felt empty and cheated, and hence why everything that came afterward, such as Arthur basically chuffing up his own escape, Harley Quinn breaking up with him, and especially Arthur just winding up back at Arkham for an unceremonious, casual death at the hands of a nobody, was all a shittily executed, unearned mess of an ending. So Todd's explanation for his choices don't really resolve any of the audience's problems with the movie. Honestly, I think it just makes it worse. Not only that, but in regards to the ending, Todd Phillips saying that Arthur has been an unwitting participant and doesn't want to be this fake icon that Gotham City put on him, and that he isn't really the Joker, he's always just been Arthur Fleck. Again, that's not what both films were telling us, and if we dial it back to that script draft written back in 2018, Todd Phillips didn't write down the character's script lines for Arthur. Every single line in the script has the character clearly labeled as Joker. Also, in one of the last sequences written down in this draft, granted this is a cut scene from the final film, but it talks about Arthur taking a shard of glass from the crashed police squad car that he did find himself in the final cut of the first Joker movie. He then takes one of those glass shards and starts cutting a smile into his own face from the slits of his mouth. The script then boldly states, quote, "Now he is the Joker." Obviously, this doesn't exactly happen in the referenced scene in the final cut, but the character arc of Arthur Fleck into Joker, even though the script always referred to him as Joker, the character arc was completed. And quote, "Now he is the Joker" perfectly lines up with Arthur's dance in front of the crowd, who have all fallen in love with his new identity and this idea of a revolutionary symbol that he has become. Yes, Arthur never intended to become a symbol of revolution, but Todd is tripping acid if he thinks both the original Joker film and this very disappointing sequel didn't show Arthur embrace what he had become. Not just the Joker persona, but all the attention that it brought him. And then in an effort to subvert the audience and try to make this self-indulgent schlock of a sequel come across as much smarter than it actually was, Todd bullshitted the quote-unquote "there is no Joker" twist into the mix, instead of actually telling a story that even remotely earned it. You know, it truly pains me to have to say this. After doing this research and looking over all this speculation, as well as tangible quotes from Todd Phillips and others as well, and the timeline of events from the first Joker movie to the second, not to mention the movies themselves. As much as I would love to, and how easy it would be to point the finger at DC, and especially at Warner Brothers themselves, whose biggest contribution to this disaster, aside from funding it, was the fact that they were total pussies. As easy as it would be to do that, the only rational conclusion that I can come to of who is directly responsible for Joker Folie A Deux being the disaster piece that it is, the blame unquestionably lies with none other than Todd Phillips. Which is a damn shame, because I actually like Todd Phillips' movies. The first two Hangovers, great. Due Date, funny as fuck. Hell, even the Starsky and Hutch remake. And of course, Joker 2019. So I don't say this with malice, and I actually respect a lot of what Todd Phillips has said publicly about woke culture ruining entertainment, the censorship of comedians, and the decline of the entertainment industry. It's just that this time he bought into his own hype, let his ego run wild, and contributed to that decline by tanking a billion-dollar movie franchise that he himself had the biggest hand in making happen, with a complete and utter misfire. Again, I stand by my statement that Todd Phillips and Scott Silver couldn't have misread the room so badly, having worked on both Joker films, and at least appearing as if they were well attuned to the outrage from select individuals that the first film received, and why. So even though there's a number of quotes from Todd Phillips himself that contradict this notion, maybe there was some foul play behind the scenes that messed with the creative direction taken on this film. Maybe there was another agenda at play, though as things stand at the moment, it's highly doubtful. Anyway guys, thanks for tuning into the video. I hope this was both enlightening and cathartic for many of you. Leave your thoughts and theories in the comments. Back with more videos soon. Take care and bye for now.